Billy Joel's early albums were massive hits. But according to an article in New York Magazine, Joel has always been unsatisfied with his music. He said, "I never felt as good as I wanted to be." He said his standard was Beethoven. Although in 2018, Joel performed his 100th show at Madison Square Garden, it's been over 25 years since he's released any new music. His reluctance to write songs stems largely from his critics, who have savaged his work as being sloppy and shallow. He said, "Because I studied music, I was always suspect to critics. To them, you're supposed to be a diamond in the rough and then polish yourself." Well, apparently his inability to overcome his internal and external critics have frozen Billy Joel's creativity. I can understand, many of you can. I struggle with perfectionism. I want to do things well, and so I often am frustrated when I don't do them well. I can finish a sermon on Friday at the office and come home, and I'm still going to spend my Saturday working it and reworking it and tweaking and adding and subtracting. I'm never happy with it. 10 people could come up to me after the service and say how much they appreciated the message. If one person had a word of criticism, that is what I would hold on to. Maybe you understand that. Maybe you're the same way. Comedian Steve Martin said, "Before you criticize a man, walk a mile in his shoes. That way, when you do criticize him, you'll be a mile away and have his shoes." Well, all of us face criticism at times. Some of it's justified, some is not. So we find ourselves the bullseye painted on our backs. It's hard to know how to respond. Anything we say can sound defensive. So in today's passage, we're given some help in how to respond to criticism, to gossip against us, to slander. This is how the Apostle Paul responded to his critics. And we head forward now. We're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. It says this, "You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We'd previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition." So Paul starts by looking back on his visit to the Thessalonian church. If you were here with us when we first started this series, you may remember that prior to arriving in the city of Thessalonica, he was in the city of Philippi. Both cities were in Greece. Both were on the main Roman thoroughfare known as the Via Egnatia. Now, while in the city of Philippi, Paul and Silas led a young slave woman to Christ. And the demon in her was cast out, and her owners were upset. They actually went to the authorities. The Roman authorities imprisoned them, but first they flogged them. And flogging was where your back would be flayed. Eventually they were released and told to leave town. They traveled along the Via Egnatia on down south to Thessalonica. When they arrived in that city, their backs were probably still bleeding from the flogging they had received. During their time in Thessalonica, another riot broke out, this time instigated by some of the Jewish leaders who did not like Paul and Silas's teaching. They were opposed to them. So the mob was put together, and the people came. They tried to seize Paul and Silas, but they couldn't find them. So instead they took a Christian named Jason. They brought him to the civil authorities. The civil authorities forced him to post bail, basically saying that there would be no more trouble or else he would be responsible for it. So Paul and Silas were slipped out of town by the Christians, and they went on down the Via Egnatia, on down to Athens, and then later to Corinth. Now, because of this humiliating departure, some thought their time in Thessalonica was a failure. So Paul wanted to remind these new believers it wasn't. Verse 1, he says, "Our visit to you was not without results." And then he reminds them of the things God has done. Paul's critics, who were unbelievers, took full advantage of Paul's sudden disappearance. They launched a malicious smear campaign. They wanted to undermine not only his authority, but also the gospel that Paul had preached, that Jesus Christ is Lord. Now, it seems the attacks were effective. Criticism, whether it's true or not, often can be effective. Apparently, some of the new believers in Thessalonica were no longer sure about Paul. So beginning in verse 3, he begins a formal defense of his ministry with them. He says, "For the appeal we made does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please people, but God who tests our heart. You know we never use flattery, nor do we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Now you might sense here that Paul's a little defensive. He feels the need to defend his integrity. I can hear Paul's enemies saying to the struggling Thessalonians, "Where's Paul now? He ran off. He left you like all these religious charlatans who come traipsing down the Via Ignatia." You see, back then, traveling preachers and philosophers were very common. Have you ever been to a carnival or to the Jersey Shore where, they have one of those games and there's someone yelling at you, trying to get you to go do the game? It's kind of the idea that was happening there in Greece. One historian says there has probably never been such a variety of religious cults and philosophic systems as in Paul's day. Holy men of all creeds and countries, popular philosophers, magicians, astrologers, crackpots and cranks, the sincere and the spurious, the righteous and the rogue, all jostled and clamored for the attention of the people. So Paul's motives were being called into question. And he knew if his enemies were successful at smearing his name, they would also be successful in convincing these Thessalonians that Jesus Christ was not the true God. So he writes to defend himself, reminding them of what things were like when he was with them. Verse 3. The appeal we make does not spring from error. So that's very important. He wants to make it clear to them. It's not it wasn't that it was untrue. The gospel is absolutely true. Jesus Christ did come. He did live a perfect life. He did die on the cross. He did rise from the grave. And because of that, the Thessalonians could trust the message that they had been taught and accepted. He also said that we did not spring from error or impure motives. Now, the Greek word for impure could also be translated ambition, pride, or greed. But normally it means sexual impurity and refers to immorality. Later, that's how it's used in chapter 4. So sexual immorality was common among secular traveling teachers. Paul's critics apparently had accused him of this, and he wants to make it clear that this is not true. None of that was ever true. He says, then he continues, saying, "Nor are we trying to trick you." In the original language, the term is a noun, and it could be used for a fishing lure. A lure promises the fish one thing, a nice fly lunch, or a nice warm meal, but delivers something very different, a hook and death. Think of it from a fish's perspective. It sees that lure and, up there, like, oh, look at that worm, like, oh, it looks so delicious. It's got some dirt on it. I love a little bit of dirt with my worms. And it goes up and grabs it, and suddenly, instead of having a meal, it is the meal. That's the idea of the tricking that was happening with these philosophers and these traveling preachers. And so Paul's making it clear we were not doing that. We were not trying to trick you or anyone else. He then says, we never used flattery. And by the way, we skipped verse 4. We're going to skip verse 6. We'll come back to them later in the sermon, so don't think I missed those. Now, Paul mentions here insincerity because it's a credibility killer. A flatterer is someone who uses smooth words to gain personal advantage. That person like, oh, I love your hair. It's so amazing. I just love how it looks. Like, if a salesman says that to me, I know they're lying, and I can ignore them. But there are those people, and you've seen them. They'll flatter you. They'll tell you whatever they think you want to hear just to get you to do what they want you to do, to get you to buy their product. We need to be careful as Christians. When we are insincere in our attempts to share our faith with others, we can come off as hypocritical and artificial, like we're a bad salesperson. Verse 5 says, "Nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed." He says this, "God is our witness." The Lord saw. By the way, just 1 second here. This sweater with this mic is going to drive me nuts. Hopefully that's better. Okay. So they were not greedy, because greed is also another integrity killer. You've seen the televangelists. They're on television crying and saying, those children in Africa, give to our ministry. We want to help them. And then later on, you find out that they have a Learjet and a $10 million home. Well, when we're insincere like this, it destroys what people think about Christians. Paul didn't take advantage of anyone financially. You know, we live in a world where there are those who would fleece the flock. And that's why it's important for believers to give, but also to know what we're giving to. The Thessalonians could trust Paul because they knew him. They'd spent time with him. They had seen his integrity lived out in front of them. You know, the world is looking for people who will stand up for what is right. Lost people are amazed when they see the difference that Christ can make in us. So how are you doing modeling Christ to a lost world? Does your integrity shine through as Paul's integrity did? As 17-year-old Nate Hassis left the football field, the senior quarterback from Springfield, Illinois High School was thrilled. It was the last game of the season. His team had won 42-20, but in addition, with a 37-yard pass at the very last seconds of the game, he had passed the 5,000-yard mark for his career, setting a new record for his conference and making him one of only 12 quarterbacks in all of Illinois high school to ever do that. But a post-game press conference with both coaches would later confirm everything was not as it had appeared. With less than a minute to go, Nate was 29 yards short of the record. His coach called a timeout, went and talked to the other team's coach, and said, "You guys have the ball right now. The clock's going to run out. Neither of us are going to score. Nate is so close to this record. So if our team lets you score, we'll just pretend we tried to tackle and you can run in, would you then be willing to do the same thing for Nate and allow him to basically have a free touchdown?" And the other coach said, "Sure, I understand." And so they went ahead, and that's exactly what had happened. Well, Nate later on found out from the press conference, and so days later he wrote a letter to the president of the athletic conference asking that the pass be stricken from the records. In it he wrote, "While I admittedly would love to have passed the 5,000-yard record, I, on the other hand, think that this is not right." And so he said, "Take it away." An AP reporter later said, "Why did you do this?" And he said, "I just didn't feel right having it. I wanted to preserve the integrity and sportsmanship of the league." Friends, what he did spoke volumes to people in that community in all of Illinois and across the country as AP carried that story. Our integrity will shine out if we'll live for Christ. If we'll surrender to the Holy Spirit, people will see the difference. And I want to know why we are the way we are. Well, it's important for me to mention here that modeling integrity does not mean being perfect. Many Christians, with the desire to avoid the credibility killers that Paul's been talking about here, put a facade on in front of their unchurched friends. It makes it look like our families are perfect. We never worry about finances. We never struggle with anything. We're not tempted sexually. We never doubt our faith, and the list goes on. And so we appear to be kin and barmy to our unchurched friends who just cannot connect at all with what we appear to be, and instead see these shallow, plasticky, shiny people who just aren't real. Modeling integrity is not the same as acting perfect. Integrity is that who you are on the outside is who you are on the inside, and that's flaws and all. We don't have to hide every flaw we have from our unchurched friends. Matter of fact, they normally will see them. And often when they see our flaws, it makes them realize we're like them, except that we are allowing God to begin to change us. Well, skipping ahead to verse 7, we read this. "Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel, but our lives as well." Now, Paul is a tough guy. He is a man's man. A lot of men think, guys in Scripture were just kind of wimpy. He was not. He is flogged multiple times. And friends, this is just not a little beating. Growing up, I grew up in the days where, you went and got the paddle and got paddled. It hurt, but it didn't really. 30 seconds later, you're fine. His back would have been torn open. He was imprisoned multiple times. Now, let me be clear. American prisons would not be a fun place to be, but you have a window. And you have lights. You get 3 meals a day. They're not going to be great meals, but you get 3 meals a day. Paul's imprisonments would often have been in dank, dark places, chained to the wall, wondering when the next meal was going to come. This is a tough guy, and yet in this passage, he talks about his love for the Thessalonians being like that of a nursing mother. And the way that she holds her baby and loves it and cares for her baby, that's what he says they were like with them. We were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. I mean, Paul loved them. And this is a guy who he wouldn't stop. No matter how much abuse he took, he was like the Energizer Bunny of evangelism. Like, he kept going and going. And yet with them, he cares for them. He is there for them. He makes it clear that he was available. He modeled truth. He was transparent. Repeatedly, he reminds them that they saw how he lived, how Silas and Timothy lived. There was no cover-up. There was no deception here. Verse 9. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to you. You are our witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. Now in verse 9, he's saying we went out of our way not to take advantage of you. That they worked night and day. So Paul was there caring for them, sharing all he had. He didn't ask them for any financial support. Now we know from other passages in the New Testament that he was a tent maker. So he would have worked with leather, he would have made tents. That's how he made money. So it appears while he's there, he's working during the day to earn money, and at night he's preaching the truth of Christ to them. Now, even though as an apostle, he's clear he has a right to financial support. He gladly gave it out of love for the people. Remember, this is a city that has traveling preachers and philosophers come through all the time, and they are after money. They are after people who will give to them. And so Paul just didn't want to be another one of them. And so instead, he earned his own way. Well, in verse 11, he changes his metaphor. He's been like a nursing mother. Now he's like a father with his own children. Paul is saying, I wanted you to succeed spiritually. I wanted you to come to faith, but also to see you grow. Then in verse 12, he says, by encouraging, comforting, urging. And with everything he could, he tries to help them move forward in their faith. Paul's love for the Thessalonians oozes through the pages here. Not only does he tell us, though, how he carried out his ministry, tucked in this section, he tells us why he did what he did. We're going back to verse 4 and 6 now. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. We're not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Now in verse 4, when he says those approved by God, he's giving the imagery of a household steward in the first century. There were people, if you were wealthy, that you had in charge of your home, in charge of your property. And they would take care of things, but you would first vet them. You would do a background check on them. Not like we do nowadays, no social security number, no fingerprint. But you would find out from others who knew this person, could they be trusted? Could they be relied on? Because you were going to be giving them power over much of what you owned. And he says that they have been shown to be approved by God. In the second part of verse 4, he says, we're not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. Verse 6 says something very similar. We're not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. See, Paul is driven by desire to please God, not people. He isn't playing to the crowd. He's not looking for their applause. He's looking for the applause of heaven. He's saying, I did what I did because I want to glorify God. So in other words, I'm not there to manipulate you. I was not there to get anything from you. I was there to honor the one who has sent me and who has saved me. Now, the language that he uses here is clear. He could have asserted authority over these people. He says, as an apostle of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. And the language literally means to pull rank. It also could mean to ask for financial support. Both of these were reasonable. Both of them could have been expected. But again, Paul did not do that. He wanted them to see Christ. And it profoundly affected how he treated people, his motive of serving God. His relationship with them was one of humility and kindness. He's driven not by desire to please the people, but to honor God. That's what drove him. You know, opposition from people was not new to the Apostle Paul. If you read about his missionary journeys, it was constant. Everywhere he went, people who did not like the message of Jesus Christ would go after him. He had his critics. Although he's an apostle of Christ, he was often attacked, verbally and physically. And again, as I said at the beginning, like Paul, we should expect to be criticized. But what do we do when it happens? How should we respond? Jim Knight suggests we can apply this in several ways. One is we need to honestly evaluate ourselves. Make sure the gossip is unjust criticism, or what someone has said to you is not true. In Paul's case, it was unjust. But our rejection should not be because of our own failure, because of our own sin, because of our own character flaws. There are times when you're going to say, they're being critical of me, and no, they're not. They're being truthful. And they're really telling you what you need to hear. Sometimes our critics are right. Author Dave Getz writes, on a fly fishing trip, it was still an hour in the truck before arriving home. My fishing buddy offhandedly observed that I was overly sensitive to criticism. He listed a couple of instances, including my response to some reviews of my writing. Suddenly, the truck felt cramped. I snapped back that simply debating what others say about me or what I do isn't being overly sensitive. And you can kind of sense he was probably being overly sensitive as he said that. He said, I asked him to give me more examples. He did, and I debunked them. Hurt, I withdraw from the conversation. I nursed my new wound from an old friend. How could I be insensitive to criticism? They're so sensitive. What is he talking about? But he says this, in the years since, I've come to realize slowly, glacially, to another layer of insight about me, myself. He says, not only am I overly sensitive to criticism, I also like to criticize others. So ask yourself these questions. Do I tell the truth? Am I honest, transparent? Am I motivated by any kind of immoral or illegitimate desires? Am I using any form of deception to achieve my goals? Do I use flattery to manipulate people? Am I using methods to hide my greed? Is my motive to serve God, or am I seeking to serve myself? The second thing to ask yourself is this, understand is this, don't let criticism paralyze you. Paul constantly is kicked out of these cities. And I'm not just talking like, hey, Paul, it might be nice if you left. Like, literally, it's sneak out or else. And yet he didn't let it stop him. He is maligned by many different people. And yet he still continues to do what God has called him to do. He completes his second missionary journey. He goes on a third missionary journey. The cliche is true. The only way to avoid criticism is to do nothing. But that's not what God wants you to do. Is just to give up. Even when there's a legitimate issue in our lives that we need to address, we need to press on with the tasks that God has given to us. John Piper says it this way, very few dreams should go on hold while you improve the shortcomings of your life. To be sure, there are times when you need to stop what you're doing and focus on conquering a flaw. Maybe there's a fatal sin that is just destroying your life. But, Piper says, all of our advances are with a limp. If you wait till you're beyond criticism to pursue your dream, he says, you'll never do it. You won't marry or stay married. You won't take your first job or stay at a job. You won't go into the missions field or stay there. Few things, he says, paralyze people more than their own imperfections. And there are always people around to remind you of your flaws and suggest you can't move forward until you're better. So if you've been making excuses for why you can't serve God, for why you can't do these things, then realize we're all imperfect. I love how he said that we walk forward with a limp. None of us in this world are perfectly whole. We all have our flaws and our failures. And yet God still wants to use us, despite what our critics would say. And then the final thing is this, respond factually, not defensively. I mean, that's what we see Paul doing here. He's open, he's transparent. He's patiently explaining his methods, his motives. In chapter 3, he goes into more detail. He explains his involuntary departure, his inability to return. Remember, Jason has to post a bond that there will be no more problems. And so instead he sends Timothy. He's letting him know, hey, I'm thinking about you. That's why I'm sending my dear friend to come and see how you're doing and to be there to minister to you. And so like Paul, when attacked, we need to be careful how we respond. Don't answer gossip with gossip. Don't be defensive. But do give an answer, a factual one, an honest one, a positive one, which is what Paul's doing here. You know, we follow a Savior who himself faced brutal criticism. And his criticism went beyond what his critics said. They had lots of bad things to say about him. It came to a cross where he hung there, and even on the cross, he is mocked and scorned. He understands the pain we feel when we're criticized. He's faced more than we'll ever face. He's been there. He took the anger expressed in the cross, and he wants to take the anger that we so often feel when we're criticized. The frustration, the desire to just give up. Forget it. If this is what I get, I'm not doing it anymore. He wants to take that and hold us close and remind us that our lives should be lived looking for the applause of heaven. Our goal should be to have Jesus say, well done, good and faithful servant. He can use criticism, by the way, to make us to be more like him. Often, those wounds we receive draw us to the cross. Often, they also show us errors in our own lives that we have been missing. Pastor Scott Saws spent 5 years working with Pastor Tim Keller. Maybe you know him as a well-known writer. He's from New York City's Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And Sauls writes that there were many ways he saw Keller live out his faith, but he said more than anything else, one thing impressed him. He said Tim could receive criticism, even criticism that was unfair, and it wouldn't wreck him. In his words and example, he taught me that getting defensive when criticized rarely, if ever, leads to healthy outcomes. He also taught me that our critics, including the ones who understand us the least, can be God's instruments to teach us and to humble us. He says you should look to see if there is a kernel of truth in even the most exaggerated or unfair broadsides. So even if the censure is partly or even largely mistaken, he says, look for what you may indeed have done wrong. Maybe the critic is partly right for the wrong reasons. Nevertheless, identify your own shortcomings, repent in your heart before the Lord for what you can, and let that humble you. And it will then be possible to learn from the criticism and to stay gracious to the critic, even if you have to disagree with what they've said. You know, God is looking for people who will live lives of integrity. But even if we're doing that, there will still be those who will come after us. And I would challenge you. We need to surrender this to God and ask him to help us respond in the way Jesus responded, in the way Paul responded, with a grace that is not of our own, and with a willingness to look at ourselves honestly. It's so easy to fool ourselves. It is so easy to think what we are, what we're not. The reality is we're more broken than we tend to think. And so allow the criticism to drive you to the cross, to the one who wants to remake you in his image. Let's pray.